Welcome to Conversations Live. Here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
Excited to welcome author and speaker Brett King to our program today. His new book is called The Rise of Techno-Socialism. Brett, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cyrus, for having me. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to chat. I'm generally, an optimist about the future, and so I'm sort of trying to look for a solution that makes life better for everybody. And part of that is through the application of tech.
Right. So I want to talk about that because I think, to be able to ask the questions, to ask the why, is that just a part of your nature, do you think, Brett, that you've always been a person looking for answers?
Oh, absolutely. But I think also, as a futurist, and I know that word probably gets misused a lot these days, but one of the things that futurists have in common is we're in a hurry to get to the future. But we tend to be more optimistic, and so you're always looking for ways to get there. So part of this is me sort of sorting through the problems we have today, particularly around inequality, and saying how do we solve these on a longer term basis.
Talk to us about the conversation around inequality. You mentioned the pandemic, and I think that really brought to bear in so many ways the haves and the have-nots, and how even when it comes to a global pandemic, how we are not all looked at the same or treated the same. What has that been like for you to kind of look at the inequalities that we face and how technology has played a role in that?
Well, inequality is nothing new. I mean, if you look at the Middle Ages, there was problems of inequality, but, it's particularly acute in the United States today. Other countries are suffering from this as well. And where we could see this was really in health outcomes around COVID. If you were in the wealthiest 1% in respect to healthcare, your healthcare experience is very different from someone who is working minimum wage, 2 30-hour jobs, for example, and can't afford, basic healthcare provisions. And so, the pandemic really accentuated this. But let's put it in context. The top 1% of Americans today have more wealth than the bottom 90%, and that's an unsustainable situation, really.
Yeah, it is unsustainable, and I think, too, it's a conversation that people are not always comfortable having, because I think it does kind of seem to divide us, unfortunately, Brett. So have you found that writing and having conversations like what we're having today are a way for us to kind of open that door for us to be able to look at where we are, how we got here, and how we can move forward together?
Absolutely. That's really at the heart of this. But when we take the issue of inequality, where does this end up? Because if we get more and more unequal or more divided economically, then ultimately, what happens? Do we have civil war? Do we have massive social unrest? You throw in artificial intelligence and climate change on top of that. Again, they're probably going to accentuate or very likely to accentuate inequality significantly. So it's a problem that's not going away, and it's you could argue, it's a functional issue with the economy, because there's no doubt that in pure economic terms, that the United States was the most successful economy the world's ever seen, particularly post-Second World War. But if you measure it by GDP growth or market returns or trade surpluses or the classical economic terms. But if you measure it by whether it looks after all of the citizens in the economy, whether it makes, it gives us life, liberty, and happiness, as a function of economic output, then on that basis, you could say the economy is increasingly a failure because there's people that are left behind. So really at the heart of this is sort of a philosophical question about what's the purpose of an economy if it isn't to look after the needs of the citizens.
Yeah. I mentioned the title of the new book a couple of times here, Brett, and I think for people who, just might be hearing about the rise of techno-socialism, talk to us about that term, because it's not something we hear a lot. Of course, we hear techno and we think about technology. We've heard, of course, a lot about socialism. Talk to us about exactly what techno-socialism is.
The big difference between techno-socialism and socialism is that the outcomes and the intent is a little different. So classic socialism, if most people are familiar with it, where it talks about workers owning the means of production. But, as we get more advanced, highly automated societies, less is built around the need for human labor because we've automated that. And so we have this sort of emerging issue. So technosocialism really is about this collective approach. How do we get to a point of optimal humanity where everyone, has their needs looked after, at least basic needs? And this is where the techno piece comes in. So we look at, for example, healthcare in the United States, which is contentious today, and we show that we could reduce the total cost of healthcare through an application of a number of technologies by 70%, 70% of where it is today. And so at that point, when you can provide universal health care to every American for a fraction of the cost of today's system, is the argument of who's going to pay for it, does that hold any weight anymore? Because now we can do it at a much cheaper than the current system. So ultimately, that's the sort of different view here, is that if socialism or broad social support is free or doesn't cost you anything, what's the intellectual argument against it anymore? Because today that's the biggest criticism of socialism. Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for universal basic income? Who's going to pay for universal health care? But if you could do it cheaper than the system today, then those arguments hopefully disappear.
Part of what you talked about, especially leading up to the release of the new book, Brett, I noticed on social media in particular when I was prepping for this segment, is that we have to be willing to have the difficult conversations, and it has to start at the top. We have to recognize, for one, something that is not always easy, and that is that we don't have the right plan, that we are not doing things the right way. Is that really where it starts, that we start having an honest conversation about where we are and how we got here?
Absolutely. This is ultimately a philosophical question. What's the purpose of humanity? We talk about Aristotle in the book. He said the purpose of humanity is to thrive. But if you look at what the advances we've made in human history previously, the times when we've made the best advances have been when we work together. Like the Human Genome Project, even the response to the coronavirus in terms of vaccine production. The Apollo project, a phenomenal example. 4% of U.S. budget committed to that. Hundreds of thousands of people working together on that, and we got men to the moon. The Great Wall of China, you could use in an argument. Even the Second World War, the massive technological advancements made on both sides because economies were focused on those purposes. So the optimal form of humanity is when we work together. That's when we can really solve these problems and make these advancements. When it comes to the techno-unemployment aspect of artificial intelligence or our response to climate change as the conditions of climate worsen, we need this collective response. But the optimistic side of me is that when we work together on these things, our potential is unlimited. The more we remain divided, and the more contentious we are in society, the less progress the species as a whole makes. And that's really the philosophical element of the book.
Brett, I want to ask you about another thing that has been in the news lately, especially because of the G20 summit that we saw, and that is also addressed in the book, and that is one of the issues is climate change. What do you think about the conversations that are happening this year, especially as it does see, they are really trying to, the different countries, really ramp up the urgency needed to act? What do you think? Do you think that in that particular area of the others that you discuss in the book, that is where we are starting to see, even though it's slow, some movement there in the right direction?
Yeah, the question is whether it's fast enough, right? So let's take, for example, coal. Elon Musk makes some good points about this. He says there is no, point in future history where we're still using coal. There's no point in future where we're still using fossil fuels because, we're going to run out of the supply of those at some point, so we need alternative measures. But let's just take coal. There was great difficulty with the COP26, sort of final agreement and statement that came out. The issue of shutting down coal plants or weaning humans off coal was very contentious. And that's probably because, we don't have all of the tech yet to roll off coal. We would need to invest in battery technology and other things like this to really transition from coal to pure, renewables-based. But if we had different incentives, we probably could do that. But the market incentivizes fossil fuel companies because they make huge profits. And so that's one of the reasons why we haven't got rid of coal as yet. But 8 to 10 million people die annually around the world because of air pollution, as an example. And so regardless of the costs associated with that, coal has not been good for the health of humanity. And yet, why haven't we eliminated coal previously? Like in the 1980s, we knew that air quality was a huge problem. But again, the market, says, well, we're making tons of money out of this stuff. Why would we want to mess with that? And so those economic interests, unfortunately, lobbying groups and so forth set policy. The largest single group, that was present at the COP26 meeting in Scotland were fossil fuel lobby groups rather than individual, other climate groups, for example. And so that fight that is there is largely because of economic interest. But sometimes we have to think beyond just pure economics and say, what's the right thing to do for humans? 8 to 10 million people dying each year because of pollution, that's untenable. We need to eliminate those problems as quickly as possible. And let's face it, solar and wind produced energy is 1/10 of the price of coal-based energy today. So there is economic incentives, but part of that is just that you have these vested interests. So ultimately, I think there needs to be a way to remove lobbying groups and those vested interests from policy making around these things, or at least better consensus mechanisms in terms of how we transition. But eliminating coal is obviously one of the most important things. And I am more positive that we're going down that path now as a result, because that problem statement has been made fairly clear now.
Brett, what is your hope as people are reading the new book, The Rise of Technosocialism, and hearing conversations like this and becoming a part of conversations like this and being informed? What is this book does for them?
Look, I don't necessarily want everyone to agree with me and the approach that we propose, but I do think we need to have grown-up conversations about the challenges we face in the future. And I think that's really the point. So, if I can encourage people to read the book, it's to come to their own conclusions. But I also, throughout the book, I talk about 4 potential outcomes for human society. We map this on a grid. The first axis of the grid is inclusion versus exclusionary or inequality. And then on the second grid, it's a dystopian sort of chaotic future versus a planned, what you might call utopian future. And in those 4 quadrants, we look at, the failed states where we just waited too long to do things. We look at the rejection of technology, possibly because of AI's impact on labor and the ethics around AI. And then we look at neo-feudalism, which is where inequality sort of gets baked in to the future of our economy, and that rich versus poor sort of gets cemented and the issues with that, or versus sort of what we call optimal humanity, where we use technology for the good of all. And those 4 quadrants that we talk about, in realistically, all 4 of those we're going to see over the next 30 years. The question is whether we learn from that process and come up with a better way to work together as humans.
Wow. Brett King, everyone, is our guest. The Rise of Technosocialism is the new book, and Brett has been a part of these conversations, as I said, even leading up to the release of the book, but also trying to get us all to have these conversations as well that are not always easy, but definitely are necessary. Brett, really appreciate you stopping by. How can our audience stay connected with you and get the new book?
Absolutely. Well, you can go to Brett King on the web, search Brett King. You'll get www.brettking.com is my personal homepage. But you could also search on riseoftechnosocialism.com or technosocialism.com. Of course, if you're here in the US, you can just go to Amazon and type in Technosocialism in the search bar. It'll get you to the book as well. And I'd really appreciate any support your listeners can give.
Well, Brett, congratulations to you again. Really appreciate the chat today and looking forward to having you back on the program again.